So there has been a trend over the last few years for YouTubers to write books. Now, unfortunately, it seems like the track record hasn't exactly gone super well. So when I saw that there was a YouTuber that I actually watch who had produced a book, I was maybe a little bit skeptical, but also cautiously optimistic. For those who aren't familiar, Jazza is a pretty big art YouTuber. I'd say one of the bigger sort of art creators here on YouTube. And honestly just makes like a ton of wholesome content and is one of these guys who just seems to be extremely good at sort of like any medium that he picks up, whether that be painting or sculpting or drawing. So when I, saw that he'd written a book, I was like, okay, because and while it's not necessarily talked about, it's definitely in relation to a particular tabletop board game that I enjoy, because Jazza is also sort of the like founder slash patron of Tabletop Time, which is another YouTube channel that I really enjoy that makes great Warhammer 40k and other sort of Warhammer content. So again, when I saw that these sort of things had come together in this confluence, I was like, all right, I want to check this out. He sort of had a newsletter, book came out last week, and I said, yeah, I want to give this a read. So this is going to be a spoiler-free review of The Ascendants, first book in his Threadweavers series. And I'm going to give you the honest lowdown on it. Do I think it's any good? Do I think it sort of iterates on the source material that it is inspired by? And do I think the actual quality of the writing is up to snuff? So like I said, this will be spoiler free. If you want to go check it out, well, you'll get my opinions on it as we go along. So let's start things off. So this is a science fantasy book leaning a little bit more heavily on the sci-fi. And like I said before, it is heavily inspired by Warhammer 40k because I am a big fan of the IP. I've done book reviews of Black Library stuff here on the channel. And one of the things that Tabletop Time has done is actually created a custom Space Marine chapter called the Ursins. In this case, they're the Urson Starborn in this context, but they basically, it's kind of like a Space Wolves successor chapter. And they did a bunch of like really cool custom STLs and other things for it, which I actually will be including in my own Space Marine army, my own Space Wolf army, which is kind of neat. And it sounded like this project started as sort of a little writing exercise when he was on vacation and was meant to be a 10,000 word short story, I think, to sort of create some lore and backstory for this sort of custom chapter, which is super cool. I think that stuff's super neat. And then it sounds like it ballooned way out past the original scope and is now going to be at least, I think, a 3-book series, which is pretty darn cool. I think we've all been there. We started that little project and then it just totally, expands beyond our initial expectations. I watched his recent video where he sort of talked about the writing process and how sort of the timelines and the crunch and the stress of that. But I think one of the things that's really interesting to note here is that this is kind of not your standard indie book, because obviously as a large YouTuber who owns is obviously a pretty big channel and has more means than most, he had access to professional editors, beta readers, developmental line copy, like the whole shebang in terms of this, as well as a whole art team, including his own art capabilities to sort of help bring this whole thing together. So if you're looking at this as sort of your standard indie author, you're like, oh, this is a first time publication. This kind of fits in a weird ground here because obviously it is totally self-pub, it's totally indie, but not a lot of folks would have the same means to put into this and actually come up with something, that has this much sort of polish put behind it. Because that's one thing that really stood out to me from the outside is this book does have a surprising amount of polish for an outright indie debut. And one of the things he even talks about in this video is this idea, there's a lot of people who say your first book's going to suck. And he's like, I didn't want that. I wanted it to be good or great. And I was like, I respect that. You know what I mean? Like, I do think there's a world where your first book can be awesome, or at least incredibly well received. Looking at you, Rothfuss. So yeah, let's talk about it a little bit more. Like I said, it's sci-fi fantasy, but leaning more heavily on the sci-fi. It follows a sort of a couple, I think there's almost up to 4 or 5 POV characters over this, but it sort of follows one main one, one Samantha Weaver, who works at a mining outpost, this really desolate mining outpost, alongside her brother Aiden. And basically their sort of backstory is that he's always sort of been, he's, I think it's supposed to be asthma or some sort of degenerative lung disease. And, he's always been picked on and bullied and is kind of weaker. And she's always been the really overprotective older sister. Mother died when they were young. Father was pseudo abusive alcoholic. So she sort of snatched up when she was old enough herself and Aiden to go work at this mining colony to sort of give them a chance at a life. But she's always been really this like someone who excels at every single thing she does. And one of the initial conflicts sort of off the bat between these characters is the idea that Aiden constantly feels like she's holding herself back to protect him. There are bullies, there's sort of conflict, I say bullies, but like, they're not kids, like they are full adults, but sort of in this context. And, she's passing up a promotion in order to sort of stay down in the mines with him. And it's sort of like, oh man, that sort of sparks the initial sort of conflict, and but there's a really strong sort of sibling love that really permeates this whole story. And obviously there are again a couple different POV characters here, but they're well done, like surprisingly well done. Again, for a debut indie writer, the characters in this book really stood out to me. Like, there are some true moments where I was like really feeling the emotion in a way that I honestly wasn't expecting to. I think the last time I sort of felt this real gut punch was with Sword of Kaigen. Again, another really strong indie novel. And, I wouldn't say the writing is nearly as poetic, or, I don't think it has necessarily the same weight, but just sort of the really real, visceral connection between these two characters is a really impactful theme over the course of this. And it's one of a couple different themes, but one, obviously, the perseverance is the other big one, because this mining colony is about to have some friends. Not exactly friends. They stumble upon this ancient nest of creatures. And again, while it's not explicitly stated, and a lot of the new videos don't mention this at all, this is basically Warhammer 40k fanfiction. Like, we all just have to, like, there's an elephant in the room, that's it. It's Warhammer 40k fanfiction, based, inspired, and these are Tyranids. They're not Tyranids in this for all, and it's part of the reason I imagine it's not referenced at all is from like a copyright perspective, and I imagine the lawyers were probably pretty explicit about that, but I am not bound by those. I'll tell it how it is. This is, probably based around some sort of campaign that was written between sort of the Space Marines and the Tyranids, because there are Space Marines in this, or Starborn warriors. One particular one here, and again, I probably will butcher a lot of these names, so I want to sort of say this in advance. And I want to sort of talk about this a little bit. Sort of the main one, Nabek, I believe is how it's pronounced. So this group of, they're Space Marines, but Starborn warriors, these super soldiers, are very strongly inspired by Native American sort of culture and folklore, and I don't really know anything about that. I am not really in a position to judge whether or not this was well represented in this book. I have no idea. I think it was Ojibwe. I'm thinking back to like old videos that I watched, but sort of particularly inspired by a couple of tribes. But I really don't know anything about this. I don't know if the culture was well represented. I don't know if the names make sense. I don't know if it's just loosely inspired or like direct old Earth sort of, names and stuff and titles put into this. So I'm probably going to butcher some names in this. But also, if there's anybody in the comments who's more familiar with, who is Native American or has more knowledge on this, I'd be curious to get your thoughts. Do you feel like this was well represented in this book? Because obviously Jazza is Australian. He has, I think, no real, and I don't know if he had sensitivity readers. I don't know if he spoke to folks who are sort of from the tribes he was taking inspiration from. I don't know the level of research that he did for this. And it was not really something that I saw discussed a ton. Kind of wish it was. I think that would have been really interesting to sort of touch on that a little bit more here, because obviously it's really heavily inspired by a real Earth culture. And, you want to make sure that if you're taking inspiration from it, I think that's great. I think anybody should be able to, but at least do it properly and do the research. So just as a heads up here. But they are, like I said, super inspired by that. They have this big sort of spirit linked animals, in this case, this massive bear. And I'm getting ahead of myself. They discover aliens deep below, and it is truly like a sci-fi horror scenario. They're coming through the pipes, they're coming through the vents, and all the miners who are trapped down there are sort of forced to flee, and it turns into an absolute bloodbath. And they are sort of forced to survive in this collapsing mining installation, and the overseers who were supposed to be protecting them are nowhere to be found. This sort of secret police that was managing all this to extract this rare resource that they're this tenebrax that they're mining. We don't know what's happened to them. And it's really sort of this race against the clock as this sort of ever evolving and expanding swarm comes for them. And it really follows these sort of real life instances of these characters. And interspersed throughout that, because this heads up, the Starborn do arrive, and there is sort of this collaboration between the everyday puny humans and these ascended warriors. And you do get some POV stuff from this sort of Captain Nabek. But I think what's really well done about this is how human the human moments feel with them sometimes, but then also still how separate they feel. Because one of the things I think that I hate to reference this, but the Halo TV show, I think fundamentally failed at, is that the Spartans in Halo are meant to feel otherworldly. They're a force of nature. The problem with that show was that they didn't make a Halo show. They made a Master Chief show, and that's not really what it's about. I want these warriors to feel separate from humanity. I want them to feel above. I want them to feel like a power, like the fist of God has come to punch the enemies in the face. Like, I don't want them, and in some moments you do have these moments of relatability, but I still want them to feel absolutely otherworldly. And I think that was captured really well because the vast majority of the POVs are the regular people. You do occasionally get these sort of cutaways to the main character, to this Nabek character, and that's how you actually start the book. You start with this first-person POV sort of dream sequence. He's sort of on like a spirit quest, and he's getting information from the Xenotarch or Nibukazo, which is it's the Emperor. This like psychic vision, and I'll be honest, the first couple pages of this book were a little bit rough from a prose perspective. I was like, it felt very on the nose. It felt very kind of heavy-handed and odd, honestly. And I was a little bit like, oh crap, it's gonna be one of those books. Like I was honestly feeling like, oh no, like oh man, it's gonna be like that. But after you get through that first sort of opening sequence, the rest of the book is in third person, past tense, like a decent third limited. And I was like, okay. And then the writing from that point gets so much better, and even the additional sort of have these sort of flashback moments of sort of learning more about this Starborn warrior's life and growing up in this culture, were better. I don't know what the heck is wrong with these first opening pages. Like if you're someone who's picking this up and you're a little like myself, who's a little bit more critical of prose, if you get past those first few pages, it gets dramatically better. I don't know because normally those first few pages are what are the most edited and refined of the entire book. They're usually what's read the most. And it was weird to me. It just felt clunky and odd. And then it gets dramatically better. And then is good. And then the book is good. It was a good book. Like I very much felt the inspirations from IPs like Alien. Like there are these legitimate horror elements. Like it's gory and it's brutal and it's visceral. And you have these really good human interactions and people make mistakes. And there's real sacrifice and real stakes and learning about the lore. And I do think that as the lore is unveiled in this, I think you can enjoy this as someone who's never experienced anything Warhammer 40k. I think it does a good enough job of introducing you to this bespoke world that you can enjoy it. But I also think you'll grin as a Warhammer, if you are a Warhammer 40k fan, because okay, so it's not the Imperium, it's the Addictum, and it's not the Emperor, it's, the Xenotarch, and it's not the Space Marines, it's the Starborn, and it's, not a plasma thing, it's Helion, and like, it's, it's one for one for one for one for one. It is a different name, and there's like a magic system that's a little bit discussed, which is very different from Warhammer, the psyching and stuff from Warhammer 40k. But at the end of the day, this is still it's a reskinned fan fiction. And I think if you go in there with sort of, a little grin on your face and acknowledge that, it becomes much more enjoyable. It still is solid on its own, for sure. Like, again, I don't want to undercut it by any means. But again, it is still that, like, you know what I mean? Like I've seen the videos of the campaigns they did with this, with the Tyranids coming out, they built all these boards on tabletop time. Like, what this is inspired by, and it is, it's still enjoyable knowing all of those things. I gave this book a 4-star. I was impressed for a debut novel. Obviously, again, someone who has more means than most to be able to polish and refine this. I didn't find any real typos. I think the pacing was pretty solid. I liked the range of characters. Again, I think the character dynamics and dialogue, it felt a little like anime heart in your hand moments sometimes, but it was so brutally honest that I liked it and I respected it. I think Jazza could have toned it down a little bit, but I think it would have been a little bit less earnest. And I definitely felt the heart on the page a little bit, especially discussing some of these sibling dynamics. And if you know things about his sibling, you may make a little bit of sense. I think maybe some things were worked out over the course of writing this book. And I respect the shit out of it, honestly. I think it was well done. I think it was a very safe way to start, of taking something, again, and sort of adapting an existing world and making it your own. And I think I'll keep reading this series. I did enjoy it. And I think it had a really sort of good beginning, middle, and end. I loved the way that sort of the humans interacted with the rest of this world. I loved the characters had real arcs over. I think I was so impressed by the arcs that some of these characters had. And I love the idea that characters can make mistakes and be very human and visceral and raw. And also that these moments where these giant hulking ascended beings also sometimes make mistakes and have these sort of different moments. So yeah, overall, I was impressed. I guess the verdict of, hey, this YouTuber wrote a book, is it any good? I think if you're a sci-fi fan, I think you'd enjoy this. I think if you're a Warhammer fan, I think you might really enjoy it, or or find it odd. I don't know. I enjoyed it. I think you probably would too. And again, I think there's a lot of potential for this series. And then I would be really, I know I'm getting way ahead of myself. I think Jazza plans to keep writing. I think he plans to do this series and maybe more. I think would be cool. I would love to see a very unique, fresh, either other sci-fi IP or something totally fantasy and totally original. I love that this is inspired by something that we all know and love, if you're a fan of this existing, but I would love to see something that is completely from scratch, completely original, because I think there's enough. Again, the dude does so many cool creative projects. I would love to see more from that. So yeah, honestly, as indie debuts go, pretty darn good. I think, one of these instances where the YouTuber actually did pretty well. So yeah, that's this, a quick, easy, spoiler-free review. I would go check it out. I think it's on Kindle Unlimited. I think it's available. I think you can also get physical books. So yeah, I would definitely recommend this one. Again, I've got I was on vacation, so videos slowed down a little bit, but I've been doing a ton of reading. Oh my God, I have been grinding the midnight oil when it comes, burning the midnight oil. That's the one. I read like 4 lit RPG books in the last like 10 days. So maybe there'll be some more. Maybe there'll be some more lit RPG on this channel. I'm just going to throw it out there if you're a fan of that as well. But yeah, thank you all so much for watching. Again, if you enjoyed this video, if you enjoy this kind of content, be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Cheers.